So have you ever been in the presence of the Great One? However you define the Great One? My first experience was 1968, and my father somehow managed to get tickets for the last game, well, what was going to be the last game in the Stanley Cup Finals in Montreal against St. Louis. And it was significant for another reason as well. That was the very last game played in the old Montreal Forum before they totally renovated on Atwater Street before they moved to the Bell Centre. And of course, a day of great excitement, and we got into the old Forum and sat down, and my father said, "You see right across there? See, that's Jean Beliveau." And there he was. He'd broken his leg that year, so he was behind the players' bench in a cast. And he said, "You know, if you go over to him and ask him for an autograph, he'll give you one." And so dutifully off around the rink I went. We were sitting on the opposite side of the players' bench and joined a small lineup of small children. And sure enough, Jean Beliveau signed our programs, but did it with such grace, like we were the only people that he'd ever done this for. And I was just so struck with him that just before probably one of the most important games of the year, he'd have the time and the grace to do that for such a small person as myself. Now, the other thing about that story is already the one who was to come was in the wings. Guy Lafleur, playing in Quebec City with the Ramparts. He would be drafted by the Canadiens in 1971 and go on to be the Great One until the next one came along. And you can fill in the blank after this. Probably Wayne Gretzky. And after Gretzky, where are we? Connor McDavid. It's easy sometimes, and in some professions and in some areas, to see automatically who the Great One is. There are all kinds of quantitative ways of determining that, whether it's statistics or whether it's just impact on whatever profession people are having. Not so much with messiahs. And there seems to be some confusion in the mind of John's disciples in the gospel reading this morning. Now, let it be said, there's absolutely no confusion in Luke's gospel about who Jesus is. And the whole way that Luke tells his story and introduces Jesus makes it clear Jesus is the one. The heavenly host knows it, his mother knows it, Anna and Simeon know it, the whole world. And it's just a question of waiting until Jesus reveals what his mission and his message will be. And also in John's gospel, absolutely clear, Jesus is constantly saying, I am the bread of life, I am the shepherd, I am the sheepfold. No question there. But Luke's gospel, or Matthew's gospel, has this very interesting exchange between Jesus and the disciples of John. John, you will remember, has baptized Jesus in the Jordan. John has been clapped up in prison by Herod because of his criticisms of Herod. And John is waiting. John is waiting to see what his fate will be. And we know that he will be executed by Herod. But in the meantime, his disciples come and say, "Are you the one? Or should we wait for another?" Now, it's a good question, because at the time, there are lots of self-proclaimed messiahs out there, or there are lots of people who are claiming that their leader is the Messiah. So, to claim to be a Messiah or to have messianic pretensions, that's nothing new. And in fact, some people were saying that John was the Messiah. So you can imagine the conundrum that John's disciples are in. Should we join your side? Should we wait for another? What do you think? And look at how Jesus responds to him, using those words from the prophet Isaiah. What do you see? The blind see, the lame walk, the poor have good news preached to them, the dead are raised. Blessed is no one who takes offense. How's that for proof? How's that for evidence? And it's one of those questions, too, that almost predetermines the answer that is going to be given. Are you the one? Should we wait for another? Convince us. Give us a word. Tell us of your power. Tell us that you are, and we will. And of course, that's not what Jesus does at all. He turns it right back on them. What do you see? What do you hear? Does this seem Messiah-like enough for you? And the really fascinating thing about this particular piece of Scripture is that when Jesus is saying all these things are happening, it's not him who's doing it. Jesus hasn't healed anybody yet in this story. It's the disciples who have. When Jesus sends them out among the towns in the Galilee, those are the instructions he gives them. Heal, preach, stay with the people, offer them the vision of the kingdom. And so in a way, Jesus is saying to John's disciples, if you see this empowerment among these people, is that sign enough? It doesn't really have much to do with me, or maybe not as much about me as you think it does. It has to do with what people are doing in this community. And if you think that is a sign of the Messiah, maybe you should join us. Now, the reality is, very few of us are going to put that kind of question, are you the one or should I wait for another, quite as baldly as that. Like you wouldn't ask your profession, are you the profession I should be in or should I wait for another? With your partners, are you the one or should I wait for another? Oftentimes we make the commitment out of a deeper knowing and then find the reasons why we've made the promise or the commitment that we have. And so when Jesus is saying, what do you see? He's asking them out of their own experience, is this worthwhile? Is this good? Do you want to be part of this? Because you are already. That question of, should we wait for another? Are you the one? Jesus turns right back on them and says, you are the ones. And should the world wait for another? Or will you take on the mission of this community? That's a tough question. And about 2,000 years later, it reappeared in American social life when Barack Obama was running for president. And one of the messages that he kept telling the people whom he wanted to vote for him were, you are the ones, we are the ones we've been waiting for. There's nobody else who's going to do the work that has to be done. It's our work to do. And here's what the fruits of that work might look like. But again, it wasn't a promise that he alone was going to do anything. It was an empowerment of a community to do the work of caring and of being a nation that was demanded in the time. And oftentimes we are placed in that position too, where something calls us to make a choice, to make a decision, to make a move. And perhaps we're not even exactly sure where it's going to lead us or what the outcome will be. But we do find, as soon as we make that move, there are other people out there who are doing exactly the same moving, who we connect with, whom we find support with, whom we find caring with, and recognize that there's a community, maybe not even in the neighborhood, but around the world, that is still active in that mission of healing and caring. I had that experience when I was doing refugee work in Toronto back in the early 1980s. We were animating congregations to support Cambodian families who had fled Cambodia, but were now, shortly after their arrival in Canada, were ready to support newcomers to Canada. And that put us into conversation with lots of other people engaged in refugee work. And there was one woman especially who always stood out for me. Her name was Nancy Pocock. Mama Nancy, she was called. She was a Quaker. She'd been a jeweler, and that was her profession. But she was actively involved in what was, for all intents and purposes, an underground railroad. Because there were El Salvadorans who were coming, leaving the Civil War in El Salvador, coming into the United States, but they couldn't stay there because the United States refused to acknowledge that it was at war. And they weren't refugees, they were just opportunists. So there was this whole community of people right through the United States who would take people in across the border in Harlingen, Texas, and transport them all the way to the Canadian border, where often they'd be met by Mama Nancy. Now, she was not an imposing character at all. She was about this high. She was into her 80s when I knew her. And she had no particular force or vigor about her that would say, do what I'm doing. But she was fearless. And I think people were captured and encaptured by that sense of fearlessness to say, you could do this too. You can be part of this. And if you try, you will find there will be people all over the network that will support you and give you courage and strength. She was the one who was to come, and she wasn't going to wait for another. And she empowered lots of people like me to do exactly the same thing in different ways. Even closer to home, that question came up. And this is one that's dear to my heart as well. When people began to get together in Edmonton to discuss the possibility of building a freestanding hospice. Hadn't been done before. And a group of people met and decided it would be a good thing. The hospice movement was vital and vitally needed here. And a group of people worked very hard over the course of about 20 years to build the first freestanding hospice in Edmonton. I was fortunate to be that much of it, a little part of it, in my time on the board there. But what really struck me was in the moments of great discussion and conversation about what direction to go, nobody ever said, somebody else should do this. It was always the people around the table who said, here's what needs to be done, and here's what we are going to do. And sometimes people came, and sometimes people went. But nevertheless, the vision was held within that community of people, and the first freestanding hospice was built without any government financial support at the time. It was all privately financed, and now the government has moved in. Not moved in a bad way, but moved in to support it. But it was only built because there were people who were there to say, we're here, and we're not going to wait for another. And we're not going to wait for another opportunity. And so that question of, are you the one who is to come? Or shall we wait for another? Maybe it's not the best question to put to Jesus. Might be the question to put to the face in the mirror that we see every morning. Because if we ask that face, there's a good chance the answer is yes. You are the one. So for this day and this story, thanks be to God. Amen.